Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our special called meeting at the request of board members. And we're here, we got 2 items on the agenda. And the first item on the agenda is, where is it? Let me look here. Overview of current COVID procedures and data in the district. Dr. Oyster.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. Good morning.
Morning.
As requested, the administration is going to share with you this overview of our procedures related to COVID-19 and some of the pertinent data related, particularly that data related to quarantine and movement from quarantine to isolation. Now, as you all, I know, are very well aware, having dealt with this now for a considerable amount of time, this could have been a 2 or 3 hour presentation, but we've tried to be very focused in it and summarize it because you've lived through this. So much of this you may find very familiar, but it will be a little bit of a refresher, and you will probably see some information that you've known in general terms, but maybe not specific terms. But we will try to go through it fairly quickly so as not to impose on your time by repeating things that you're already aware of. So the first thing we want to look at, and you have that in your board docs now. I don't know if you need to refresh if you have it with you. You may be able to see that. If I get these progressive lens just exactly in the right spot, I can read it from here. And if I move my head too quickly, I've blurred it. But what you see in this very first flow chart is the employee COVID-19 reporting process. Number 1, an employee notifies a supervisor. Number 2, the supervisor or the employee complete a questionnaire. It's about a page-long questionnaire. Number 3, that questionnaire is submitted to an employee COVID-19 guidance team. And then when you go on through the flow chart, that's abbreviated as ECG2. We have 5 employees that comprise that team. 1 who does it in addition to their normal work during the day, 1 retiree who does nothing but that for us, and then the rest of them are individuals who do this after hours in addition to their regular work, for which we compensate them additionally. They process reports 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, in order to get the information back to employees and supervisors as completely, as quickly, as accurately as they can do, because that has to do with employees being at work, going to get a test if they need to, doing the appropriate things. So you'll see number 4, they evaluate it. They select an appropriate guidance template. If you fall in this category, here's what you need to do. They fill in that template because some of it is pre-filled, some of it requires some customization to the person. They fill that in, has dates for the start, the end, if you need to be tested, if there's some masking requirement, all right, then that goes back to that employee and to their supervisor. They then update our tracking spreadsheet, which contains the information for everybody. That is the information that Jason's group in research and evaluation pulls to do the statistical reporting and the summary nighttime reports. But you see they issue the guidance back to the supervisor and to the employee. All right, and number 10, you see that they manage these additional processes that are related to specific guidance: verification of vaccine cards, verification of test results, verification of contact tracing, cross-checking questionnaires with DHEC's list of positives. Throughout the process, they field questions and they send reminders. Again, they've loaded that on that spreadsheet, so when you get to number 11 and number 12, it talks about how that data is translated, produced for reports for us internally, and also for the dashboard that becomes public on the website. That's for employees. All right, the second page is very similar. There are a few differences. This is the COVID reporting for students. They're exposed or they're positive. And you follow the very same chain. When you get to number 3, you'll immediately see one difference. There are 41 employees handling that reporting process. A handful, I believe there are 3 or 4 during the day, that are assigned from nursing that are not able to serve in a school as a nurse for various reasons. They handle that during the day. They are supplemented by more than, 35, 36 other employees from throughout the organization that have been trained to take the reports and issue the guidance, for which they are paid extra. And all of the pay for this is coming from ESSER funds. No money being used from the general fund, no money being removed from schools or from the general operations of the school district. It's coming from ESSER funding. It requires that number of people to provide that processing 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we want the information to go back as quickly and as accurately as possible. That does 2 things. Number 1, it relieves a school, individual school, from having the burden of doing all of that. But secondly, it ensures accurate, consistent information, because it's the same people giving the same answers to, it's not always the same question, but the same questions over and over and over to ensure we're being consistent and applying the appropriate standards. Then you'll see it follows a very similar pattern. It's reported back to the school. Now, the schools gather the information from students by utilizing their current staff, and we allocate to every school a certain number of hours at a particular rate of pay where they may employ someone in their building after hours to help with the collection of that. That too is paid from ESSER. And we allocate hours based on the size of the school. Obviously, having to do with the bigger the school, the more reports you would have. And that is an allocation that, and the principal determines who would be the best person to handle that. They're trained to do it. It may be more than one person in some schools. Then you see it follows that same pattern. You have specific guidance that varies based on what's entered on the form. It then put in a spreadsheet, goes into the data system, and then it's used to populate our dashboard. All right. Current quarantine options for close contact exposures for employees. Number 1, option 1, they continue to work following exposure. They must be asymptomatic. They must wear a mask through day 10. This option is available regardless of vaccination status per DHEC as of January the 16th of 22 due to crisis staffing conditions. Those who are not maximally vaccinated, initial series plus booster if eligible, or present proof of positive test for COVID-19 within the past 90 days must take COVID-19 test on day 5 to continue working through day 10. They can come to work, have to go take that test, and to continue, have to have a negative return. The second option, they may return after day 5 if a negative test is obtained and they are asymptomatic. No test is required if maximally vaccinated or if tested positive for COVID-19 within the past 90 days. Mask must be worn through day 10, regardless of vaccination status or previous infection. Basically, that change, which was promulgated to us on Sunday morning, January the 16th, and in a minute that'll mean something a little more to you if you think about what else happened on January the 16th. That was the largest snowfall in Greenville in, I don't know, 15 plus years probably. That was affected the entire county. So that change occurred. We immediately implemented it. So people that were already out, they got revised advice, direction, and from that point forward, we used that revised direction. All right. For students, Option 1, they stay home for 10 days following exposure. Option 2, they stay home for 5 days following exposure, returning to school starting day 6. They must be asymptomatic, documented by a parent note upon return, and they must wear a mask through day 10. That was originally put forth by DHEC requiring them to get a test in that intervening time. That was relaxed to this current standard. Option 3, they can continue to attend school following exposure if they're age 18 and over and maximally vaccinated. So over 18, that's an initial vaccine series and a booster if eligible. 17 and under, fully vaccinated, which simply means they've had dose 1 and 2 of the 2-dose vaccines or 1 dose of the 1-dose vaccine. Or present proof of positive test of COVID-19 within the past 90 days, PCR, antigen, or we now accept a home test. In all of these scenarios, the students must be asymptomatic, wear a mask through day 10. All right, what impact does that have on presence in school, whether it's employee or student? All right, we're looking at this year. We want to stay in this school year and look back last year. We've got greater consistency in data this year. This includes dealing with, at least to this point, the Omicron variant, the Delta variant. So these are the better basis and more consistent basis of comparison, as opposed to going all the way back to our first record keeping in March of I guess it was March the 16th of 21. So you'll see we've had 2,160 employees isolate from 17 August to 15 January. We've had 1,178 employee quarantines. We had 417 employees move from quarantine to isolation, i.e. they went from having been exposed to they're positive. That's a 35.4% of the total employee quarantines. Now, one thing you'll notice when you look at this and you look at the next slide, there are far fewer employee quarantines than there are isolations. While we do not have a specific number or percentage of our employees who are vaccinated, obviously a much larger percentage of them are vaccinated. We know nearly 4,000 of them were vaccinated through us, but that would mean they never went to quarantine, giving you a much lower quarantine number, because you're also going to see a much higher ratio of moving from quarantine to isolation among employees than you do of students. All right, so if you look at the period 1 January to 15 January, we had 1,185 employee isolations. In that window, we had 1,185 compared to the entire total for the year prior to that of 2,160. We had 635 quarantines with 236 moving from quarantine to isolation. That's a 37% ratio. Now remember, you look down there starting January the 16th, as long as they're not displaying symptoms, employees could be at work, even though there is, based on this data, a mid 30% likelihood they could move from quarantine to isolation. Student data, it's a little bit different. Total student isolation, 17 August to 15 January, there were 9,755. There were 34,432 student quarantines. That is a student, a quarantine. Now, while this would be a smaller percentage within that, if you were to have quarantined twice, you're 2 of the 34,432. So these are not unique individuals. We do not track it that way. We don't have the ability. Some of this stuff, we don't have the, we can't devote any more resource to tracking some of these things. Some of them it would be, I think, probably interesting to know, but if it's not directly related to an operational need or reporting need, we just don't have the resource to track it, nor do we need to go out and expend even ESSER funds to track something that's not going to go directly to reporting or operational needs. So, but at the end of the day, that means 34,000 students, some more than once, have missed some amount of time. In worst case, it could be 10 school days. That's not likely because most of them are going to fall over one weekend or two. So we can't tell you the precise number of days per person. But this is a significant, I mean, you look at that quickly and tell it's significant. We've got 76,000 students. Even if you assume some of these are twice, and perhaps there's some really unlucky person that is 3 times, but that would be very, very few. But there's going to be a number in here that are twice. All right, moving from quarantine to isolation, from 17 August to January, middle of January, 15 January, 2,230, 6.5%. 35% of employees moved from quarantine to isolation, 6.5% of students. August 17 to 27. All right, you see why that's noted differently. You went from a 6-foot, DHEC changed the definition of close contact from 6 feet to 3. In that window of time, we had 908 isolations, 2,715 quarantines, 289 students moved from quarantine to isolation. That's a rate of 10.7%. Now that will not necessarily reflect everybody that could have been impacted by that change. Because if you look at the last day it was in place, you could have had a up to 10-day lag of a report from somebody that was affected during that time. Likely it's going to appear in day 3 to day 5. The further you get out, the less likely it will appear. All right, so January 1 to 15, this month through the 15th, 4,296 student isolations, 11,801 of those 34,432 quarantines. Okay. 806 moved from quarantine to isolation, 6.8%. All right. I had mentioned to you all before in reports provided and some written summaries to the board that we have communicated during this school year, we the administration, to the Department of Health and Environmental Control, our concerns about the number of students quarantined, the amount of time missed from instruction, and because of the way we keep data, our knowledge of the very low percentage of students who move from quarantine to isolation, that go from being exposed to testing positive, or to being, in some cases they test positive, they have some symptoms, some cases they have no symptoms and they tested positive, some cases they have symptoms and perhaps don't test positive, which they could have, I guess they could have COVID and it not be detected by the test, or they could have something similar to it. But this only talks about the ones that we know were quarantined because of an exposure. That exposure could have been in school or not. All right, you could be in quarantine because you got exposed at home because brother or sister or parent or some other family member living in the household had COVID and you were exposed to them. You could have been exposed in a setting outside of the home or outside of school. And you could have been exposed at school. We don't separate those out. We don't really have the ability to separate all those out. We know you had an exposure as defined by DHEC. You went into quarantine status. You fell under one of those options. That was how we treated you. All right, so August 27th, DHEC notified all districts of an updated data collection system. We inquired why the report would include numbers of quarantines and isolations of student and staff, but not the number of quarantined who subsequently become positive for COVID. We sent several follow-up communications on that issue. In other words, that's never data that's ever been collected by DHEC. We collected it, this school district. There are a few others that collected it. I'm not sure anybody has collected it longer than we have because we began to collect that early on. On September the 1st, we shared our numbers of quarantines, isolations, and the numbers and percentages of quarantines to isolations to date at the monthly statewide superintendent's meeting, directly to DHEC, and again advocated for DHEC to collect the data that we believe should be studied to inform social distancing requirements and what's used to determine quarantine, well, who's required to quarantine. On September the 2nd, DHEC did notify us, along with other districts, that the agency would begin collecting this data. And I think they started, if I recall, they started with a sample group of districts, but they now collect from all districts. On October the 7th, we shared our data and addressed the issue of low quarantine to isolation percentage for students to DHEC, directly to the DHEC administration, again at the monthly statewide superintendent's meeting, requesting again that this data be considered in updating quarantine requirements. September 21 forward, we've provided a weekly data report to DHEC, and we've continued to communicate with and request clarification from DHEC regarding quarantine requirements and updates to those requirements. Now, as you've seen, they have modified their requirements to a degree. Still believe they have not perhaps modified them to the point the data would indicate they could do so. All right, so what have we perhaps posed to them? What would we look at there? All right, they could revise a definition of close contact to go back to 3 feet, regardless of the mask status, and instead of the 6 feet. They started the year at 3 feet, then they went back to 6 feet. All right, or continue to contact trace, inform parents of an exposure. I think that's something a parent would want to know, been exposed to it. Now, it still requires a lot of work, but that's important to reassure people and to let them know, well, maybe, you need to be watching to see if symptoms develop. I would think, most people right now are pretty attuned to watching for symptoms, but maybe not everybody. Continue to contact trace and inform parents of exposure, but do not require quarantine if no symptoms are present. That'd be another option. That's basically, I believe, exactly what they're requiring for employees now. That in our data have about a 35% chance of moving from quarantine to isolation. And simply the last thing is just to adopt that same standard for students as for employees, which really is a combination of perhaps the first thing. All right. Here's the impact on before and after changing quarantine requirements. I'm not going to dwell on this. You can clearly read that for yourself. It shows by level. These are employees, new isolations. And you see the footnote. We gave you the most recent data. This was interrupted by our weather-related closure. Now, historically, through this pandemic, if schools are closed, when we come back, the number goes up. But this is the first time we've been closed where I think arguably for, at least during the closure, if you count, well, I think you'd count Sunday as not an ordinary school day. I don't believe there were many people going many places Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. So unlike, and there were some people couldn't get anywhere on Thursday, some of them Friday. So unlike other closures, it might not have had a boosting effect to positives. It may well have had an effect of reducing because exposure was reduced. So that's why that footnote's on there. It's kind of hard to draw a full conclusion from it. But you can see that obviously it dramatically dropped after the change in quarantine requirements. But you're still looking at a ratio that's, I mean, you went from I don't know, 50% to 30 or something. The next one is the before and after change in quarantine. All right, so you had new quarantines Monday compared to Tuesday, 110, 111, and then the comparison the same 2 day, 124 to 125. Again, you had that intervening time that we really can't tell the impact. But it might look a little different from this, but it's still going to be, I would firmly believe, based on our whole year's experience, a tremendous difference in the number of people that are out, even when you temper in the fact we were closed for that week. All right, students, new isolate, you see that one, the comparable days after changing quarantine requirements. And you see the before and after change in quarantine requirements Monday and Tuesday, and you see the dramatic drop in it. Again, you just, there's been some days where there was a downward trend out in the community in positives. There were other days when it was up. It's been sort of an up and down. We did have that period where we were shut down and the community was shut down in effect for several days. So it's a little hard to determine that, but we just wanted you to see the most recent statistics. Be glad to answer any question that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Royster. Do we have any questions? Any questions? Ms. Doolin? And let me remind everybody to pull the mic closer, because we did have a couple that said they couldn't hear at the last meeting. So pull the mic close.
That better. Dr. Royster, thank you for putting this together, especially so quickly. My one question is, you brought up that student quarantines included quarantines that were not from school exposures, any community exposure, even, and you brought up sibling exposure. Mm-hmm. And so if you're quarantined with a sibling who is isolating, it's probably difficult to really quarantine in a household with someone who is actively sick. So that might explain some of those that become isolated because they test positive for COVID because they're living with someone else that is COVID positive. So that, we can't do anything. Nobody can do anything about that because, I mean, you live with your siblings. But that might account for some of that 6.5%.
I believe that is accurate. There are some circumstances. They tend to be with our older students where they are able to keep them separate in the house from the one that's isolating, but that is less often than the majority. And it certainly would be very difficult. It's very difficult to do that. And so I think that would logically, could conclude that a fair number of that percentage would be sibling exposure.
I think that's probably very true too. Thank you. That was my only question. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Ms. Doolin. Anyone else have a question? Anyone else? Ms. Goodwin-Caldwell.
Okay, I understand what we asked in this letter, to relax the DHEC quarantine guidance for students to align it with the current guidance for staff. But we have to make sure that the parents and the students adhere to that, because with staff, I know they're employed, they know they've got the mask, and that's been one of the contentions of this thing with the masking of the students. So how are we going to be assured that they are going to go by that guidance if we are asking this, that they be it aligned with the same thing for the staff?
Ms. Goodwin Caldwell, are you talking about the letter?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about the second item.
But also, it was, he's talking about the quarantines and the isolations.
Yes, ma'am.
If we do, because one of the things was to adopt the same standard for the students and the staff. How can we assure that the students do the same thing that the staff does? That was in the presentation.
Yes.
So.
Yes, ma'am. I don't know that I've specifically mentioned it, but we are currently having to do that with return. So the same way we're currently doing it.
With the return of the
It would be a
students.
larger number.
Okay. That's what I needed to know.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis.
So this morning I was getting ready for work, and my wife was getting ready to go to school, and I talked about the changes in the DHEC expectations that happened on January 16th, and she and I had different understandings of even what has happened since January 16th. So can you just repeat for my benefit, because I'm sure that I was wrong in the conversation, what are the new protocols for staff effective January 16th?
And that may always be a wise position to take with your spouse.
I'm not putting it on record. That's the best I can do.
Now the record fully reflects that. The change, and I'm gonna get Janet to speak to it. I don't want to leave anything out. You all know Janet Loggy is Director of Health Services for the district. I'm gonna ask her to summarize that, make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then that too will be on the record. Then y'all have to debate about who was ultimately correct or not, Mr. Lewis.
There's no question who is right.
Okay, so your question is about the change for employees,
Yeah.
correct? So DHEC has now allowed employees to work during quarantine, regardless of vaccination status, as long as they're wearing a mask through the 10th day after exposure. Those who are not maximally vaccinated and those who do not have documentation of a positive test in the last 90 days from the date of exposure are required to test on day 5.
So can we do it again? Because I
Yes.
think I heard the difference. I'm trying to understand what the difference is between what we're doing today and what we were doing on January the 10th.
So the difference is those folks who are not vaccinated and do not have a positive test in the last 90 days are allowed to work days 1 through 5
Okay. And
with a mask on, provided they test on day 5. That's the only difference.
that is solely for asymptomatic individuals. Is that
Correct. That goes for anyone. If you're vaccinated, exposed, and develop symptoms, you have to isolate and get tested.
So in the district currently on today, if an individual is exposed, whether they're vaccinated or not, if they're exposed to a COVID positive individual and they are asymptomatic, then they can continue working for those 5 days. And then they're required to get a test?
Those that are unvaccinated or do not have a positive test documentation
Okay.
are required by DHEC. It's a requirement to test on day 5 of that
Okay.
quarantine period.
Okay, so you've had an exposure in your classroom. Teacher can return to school for days 1 through 5 of that exposure, whether they've been vaccinated or not, as long as they're asymptomatic.
Correct,
On day 5, they have to take a test.
correct.
Those test results don't come back on day 6. So are they still able to come back to work until the test results?
Yes, DHEC has not told us when we have to get those test results.
Okay.
They have not given us a time frame, but we have a process in place where we're looking for them. So if the employee is directed to test on day 5.
Okay. So they test on day 5, but they're still able to return days 6 through 10 until those test results
That's
come back
correct.
to say they are positive.
Yes,
if-
sir.
if the
Or
test re-
negative, hopefully, yeah.
If the test results are negative, they're already in the classroom, right? So there's not a
keep-
change for that individual.
That's right. If they get a positive test, then they must isolate.
Okay, and is there within any of that a mask requirement for any of those adults?
Yes, anyone exposed has to wear a mask through the 10th day of exposure. Vaccinated, unvaccinated, no history of a test, anybody.
And that's regardless of the results of the test on day 5?
That's correct. You wear a mask through day 10.
Okay, so you're in a classroom, you're exposed, you're going to wear a mask for the next 10 days, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not, regardless of whether you're symptomatic or not, regardless of whether you test positive or not.
Well, if you're symptomatic, you're
Oh,
not
well,
at
you're not
school.
coming to class. Okay.
Right.
And that is different from what we did on January the 5th. How? Like what?
The difference is we're allowing folks that are not vaccinated and don't have history of a positive test to work days 1 through 5.
So prior to January 16th, all that we just described would have applied to vaccinated individuals could have come back who are asymptomatic.
Correct.
But now we're grouping in with vaccinated individuals. Unvaccinated individuals also can come back now until they have a positive test.
With the testing requirement on day 5.
Okay.
You're right.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Oh, I knew going into it that I was wrong, but
You finished, Mr. Lewis? Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Thank you, Ms. Loggins. Ms. Mosley, you have a question? No?
Just a quick question.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Ms. Loggy, the test that they require on day 5 cannot be a rapid test. It has to be a PCR test.
No, we'll accept a
Oh, you'll accept-
DHEC attestation form on day 5, yes.
Is that a rapid test?
It's a home test,
home
which is a
test.
rapid test,
Okay.
not administered by
So
a
some-
healthcare
so some-
professional.
Okay, so some of the testing that's going on day 5 for anybody that's exposed, we could be really getting the results back fairly quickly.
We could if they had a
If they
home
have,
test.
if they have access to it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just want to make sure. All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mosley. Ms. Goodwin Caldwell.
Okay. I had somebody to contact me and they were told that it starts from when they have the symptoms. Is it start from when they have the symptoms or when they test positive? When they get their test back positive, when does the 5 days start?
So the isolation period starts for a symptomatic person. Day 0 is the day of symptoms. The next day is day 1. If you're asymptomatic, your day 0 is the day your test is obtained. Day 1 would be the next day.
Okay. 'cause
So if my
the-
symptoms start on the 20th, the 21st is the day 1, then you move on for 5 days from there.
Okay, because she was confused and she thought she was told that it was from the day that her symptoms started and not the day that she got the test back being positive. Because if it was from the day the symptoms started, she got the test back on that 5th day, she was told she could return to work on that 6th day still tested positive. Is that true?
That's accurate. We start the day the symptoms start, add 5 days to that, and then you can return. On day 6, if you're feeling better, your symptoms are significantly improved, and you don't have a fever for 24 hours without using fever-reducing medicine, you can return on day 6. So we do start when the symptoms start. As long as they correlate with the, the test, makes sense that those symptoms led up to that test. And they didn't develop new symptoms along the way. There's always unique circumstances, but that is accurate.
Okay,
Some-
so she can return even though she had a positive test on the day after she got that positive test?
Yes, ma'am.
What you tell them?
That's what I'm telling you, yes.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Ms. Goodwin Caldwell. Thank you, Ms. Logan. Any further questions? Hearing none, thank you, Dr. Oyster.
Sir, thank you, Mr. Meek.
We will move ahead to the second item on the agenda is approval of a letter to Governor McMaster and Dr. Simmer regarding quarantine requirements and COVID-related procedures. There's no presentation. This is asked by board members, and is there a motion?
Yes.
Ms. LaVentus Wells.
I recommend to approve the letter to the Governor McMaster's and DHEC Director, Dr. Simmer, regarding quarantine requirements and COVID-related procedures.
We have a motion on the floor. Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Ms. Mosley? No, Ms. Mosley. Okay. Mr. Lewis?
So first, Mr. Chairman, I'm unclear who to ask questions to. So can you clarify the process?
Always to the chair.
So you would like us to direct questions to you and then?
Yes, yes, sir.
And then
Then I'll pass them on if I need to.
we need to ask all of our questions at once, or can we ask them?
I'd ask one at a time, not confuse me.
But we don't lose the floor by asking a question and waiting for an answer.
Do what now?
But we don't lose the floor by asking a question and waiting for the answer.
No. I'll give it back to you.
I just want to make sure.
Yes.
not
Will
very
you pull your
often that
mask
we
a
have-
little, will you pull your mic a little closer?
Sure.
Thank you.
It's not very often that we have recommended motions come like this, and so I just want to make sure that we understand the
Thank you.
protocol. So I
Thank
guess
you.
my first question is for Dr. Royster, which is, we have a letter here which essentially is recommending that DHEC review its protocols, and one of the final recommendations is that we consider adopting protocols for students that are similar to those for teachers. So does the administration have a comment on that or position on that recommendation?
The administration has no objection to the letter. It appears to me that it very much aligns with those things that we have previously communicated to DHEC. The only exception would be where you speak to making it the same as the employee direction, because we've not yet communicated any position to DHEC about that. So I'm not saying I don't agree with that. That's never been anything we've communicated to them, because we've had no communication directly with them since they made that change on 16 January. But all the rest of it really fully aligns with what we have said to them before. We presented our data. We said it appears to us this data doesn't indicate that the quarantines need to be as restrictive as they are when you balance the absence and loss of class time with the very low percentage of students who move from quarantine to isolation. What occurs to me now that they have relaxed the employee standards, our employees, as we presented to you today, have a much higher rate of moving from isolation to quarantine. It seems that statistically it's less questionable to move students than it would have been to move employees. And I know, I'm certain based on the release that came to us about it, they did that in consideration of being able to staff schools and keep them open. But as you know, we can see by our numbers, we've had more absences for quarantine than there are students in the majority of school districts, individual school districts in the state of South Carolina. And proportionally, this is going to affect others the same way it does us. Their number's not going to be that large. It's not going to be 30-something thousand, but it's going to be proportionally as impactful to them if they only have 1,000 students. So in my mind, I see nothing there that is not in alignment with the things we've asked them. We have never said to them, we're not health professionals. Ms. Loggy is, but the rest of us aren't. We're not epidemiologists or anything like that. We've just said, here are our statistics. It does not seem to us that the negative impact of these absences from school is supported by the statistical information we have. We think you need to do something differently here. And it appears to me that's what you all are asking, perhaps in a little different language, what you all would be asking if you choose to approve this letter and submit it. Hopefully that answers your question, Ms. Lewis.
It does. So if DHEC reviewed our data and they reviewed the recommendations from this board and from others, and they adjusted their exclusion list for students to align it with the similar protocols for teachers, you would be comfortable adopting those protocols at this district level?
Yes, sir. I think, given one caveat, that we, despite the tremendous effort and individuals it requires to do so, that we continue to, whatever their definition of contact trace is or becomes, we continue to do that so that a parent would know if their child's been exposed. I believe that's an important caveat. I don't think you all, from what I saw in this draft, I don't believe you all addressed that in there. To me, that would be the only thing that would cause any discomfort to me, is that we fail to continue to notify parents.
The next question I have, I think for you, Dr. Oyster, is the letter represents a different time period of data than the data in your slide. So if you look at paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it says between August 17th and December 31st, and the slide we have is August 17th to January 15th. So I just want to know, those numbers wouldn't be the same because they're different periods of time. Do you believe that the number of quarantined and the number of students testing positive in this letter are accurate, even though they are using a different time period than the?
I believe they're accurate for that time period. What I might suggest is that if you all were to approve this, that perhaps you might approve it in concept. And I would assume, because normal protocol is then a letter from the board comes from the chair, normal protocol, that perhaps the direction be to include our most recent statistics. You all know what they are. We wouldn't be putting something in there you didn't know. That we would include those that were presented today. We wouldn't want to wait and get some more statistics, but the ones we presented to you today, which are certainly accurate. And I'm sure these are accurate because they came from our data. And again, there's always going to be a lag time. If you wait, you'll pick up more, you'll pick up fewer. But these are as of the dates that we cited, that we may have already gone past. That's all right. You all have that in front of you. That would simply be a suggestion from the administration.
So Mr. Meek, that's fine with me. I just want to make sure that the data that's in our presentation matches the data that we are sending as guidance to another organization.
Okay, let me cover in just a sec. Is there any objection from any of the board that we use the current data instead of what's in the letter? Is there any objection to anybody on the board? Okay, that's covered.
Okay. So I guess in just my other question, because I will say, I know we talked about the advocacy committee meeting, and I do think it would have been cleaner if this had gone through advocacy, but it didn't. And we can talk about that at the next advocacy committee meeting about why it didn't. But I do appreciate the opportunity that was given for board members to submit revisions. And I submitted a number, and most of them are in this letter, and I appreciate that. There were two that weren't, though, and I would like to just maybe talk about the two that weren't, so that maybe somebody could give me an explanation for why that choice was made or not made. So the first one is that historically, when this board sends a letter to someone, we historically send letters from one elected body to an elected official, and not to an employee. That we have typically reserved employee-to-employee conversations to be something that we would direct the superintendent to do with an employee. But this letter goes to Governor McMaster, who I think would be the appropriate recipient of this letter, but then it also goes to an agency director who is not an elected official. I think I explained that in the email. I'm just would like to know maybe why that's here is this way, and if maybe there was some intent to that.
Okay. Ms. Mosley, you want to answer this?
I'll
Go ahead.
answer my intent. No, I don't, our intent. So in the state of South Carolina, the department, this agency is not a cabinet level agent. It's not a cabinet level position. And so my intent was, or my understanding, and this could be a little bit of a misunderstanding, but my understanding is that the governor, while I do believe needs to be addressed, the governor can't necessarily, what's the right word? He cannot direct an agency that isn't in a cabinet level to do something. It still has to come, I mean, it still has to be from the Department of Health and Environmental Control. And I guess my logic, or I should say our logic, because it was a group effort in drafting this, was that Dr. Royster, our district, has been providing DHEC directly all of this data for all of this time. And I guess we just felt like both people were audiences for this. It's really, there wasn't any, anything beyond that. So that was our logic.
Okay, anyone else on the floor want to reply? No? Mr. Lewis, did that answer your question?
It answers part of it, but it doesn't change it. I still, this individual is a political appointee who is hired by a board whose chair is appointed by the governor. And so if the governor does direct DHEC through those appointments to the board, all the data that's been provided to date has not been provided at the direction of this board to DHEC. It was provided by the staff of this school district to DHEC, which is the appropriate open level of communication. So we have just historically not sent letters telling employees how to do their job. We have sent letters to elected officials who are responsible for those employees to help guide them on how to do their jobs. And it seems like this is an awkward turn here to now say we're going to tell a state director what he or she should do when we have historically have leveled all of our communications with elected officials. So it was my recommendation that we remove that, but also it would be my recommendation that this letter go to the legislative delegation who could influence that board's conversations with the DHEC director. And if you did both those together, you took out that it was going to the director and you sent it to the legislative delegation, then it would make sure that our conversations as an elected body are continuing to be had with other elected officials.
Okay, Dr. Oyster, you want to speak?
Yes, sir. As you were saying that, Mr. Lewis, a thought occurred to me. I think you're entirely correct as far as historically, the past protocol has been for the board to kind of address elected officials. This is a kind of a unique situation. I believe, Doug, you may have to track this for me to make sure I'm correct. I don't know if Julie's not in here, although she did just walk by the door. I believe.
She ran by the door.
Yes, she did. She was moving very quickly. She heard me call her name. I believe the DHEC board is appointed by the governor, but maybe not exclusively by the governor. What if you all were to consider addressing the letter to the chair of the DHEC board and copy the governor, the director, and I think your suggestion was excellent in making our legislative delegation aware by copying them. Then everybody that ought to know knows, and I think to your point, that seems more fitting with past actions of the board. Even though the DHEC board is not an elected board, they're an appointed board charged with governance and policy making and that sort of thing. If that, just a suggestion.
Mr. Lewis, would that satisfy your concern on this?
Thank you.
Okay, let me ask the board, just like I asked before, does the board have any objection for us to address the letter to the chairman of the DHEC board? Is there any objection to that?
As well as the governor and.
No, that's next. No objection to that. Also, we'd send a CC to the governor and the director. Any objection to that? No objection. Also send copies of this letter to our legislative delegation. Any objection to that? Okay, we will redraft that whenever we get through here. Okay, Mr. Lewis, you still have the floor.
I just have two more. So the last one, so historically, when we send documents, we send resolutions, and they're generally not signed. So this letter says sincerely Greenville County Schools Board of Trustees, and I'm unclear whether that is going to be signed by the chair on behalf of the Greenville County Schools Board of Trustees, or if it's the expectation that every trustee is going to sign it, like was done in one of the Midlands districts when they approved their letter earlier.
Okay, any of the four want to answer that? Ms. Mosley? No?
I would say that the chairman of the board signed.
I'm comfortable with whichever.
I feel like the chairman of our board should sign it because he represents all of us.
Any other question, comment? Is that okay with the board that the chair signs the letter?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Lewis, you still have the floor.
We're just rolling right along here. Thank you,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman. So the last one I have is just there's a word that's used in this letter that I don't think it's used differently than the words used by the staff when they gave presentation. And that is in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, in paragraphs 4 and 5. I'll start with paragraph 4. It says in the highlighted section that you have, but it's not highlighted for everybody else. After reviewing isolation and quarantine data, we find that our district is forcing well students to be absent from school. But I don't remember us having discussions about determining whether the student was well or not. I think we determined the students were asymptomatic. And I think it's a pretty big difference of words between an asymptomatic student, which is the ones we are forcing to stay home that we would like to see back at school, and a well student who may have a whole host of other illnesses that we don't address in this letter. And so we use well in paragraph 4, and we use well again in paragraph 5. And my suggestion would be that we just replace well with asymptomatic, which would be in line with the data report that the administration just provided us about the number of students who are unnecessarily quarantining because they are asymptomatic.
You have heard Mr. Lewis's recommendation. Is there any objection to put in asymptomatic instead of well? Ms. Doolin?
That suggestion was discussed, but the term asymptomatic implies that you are sick, you just don't have symptoms, rather than being COVID negative or healthy or well. So asymptomatic implies that you're COVID positive with no symptoms. And that isn't reflected in any of our data. It's either you're isolated or you're quarantined, but not that you are quarantined and asymptomatic or anything different. That was the only reason. So maybe a compromise would be to say that well students and asymptomatic students are having to stay home when well teachers and asymptomatic teachers are able to be in the classroom.
And Mr. Lewis, your comment.
I don't think well is the accurate word. So I think we just heard that asymptomatic is the measure that we're using to determine whether or not a teacher can come back. So if it's not asymptomatic, I'd be willing to hear what another word is, but I don't believe well is the right word. Because I think well implies healthy, and I don't know that any of this data measured whether the student was healthy or not. It just measured whether they were testing positive for COVID or not, which I think is a different measure of health. So perhaps a better definition would be COVID negative, which would, I believe, I'm looking at the chart here on employee data, and we measure number of employees isolations, number of employees quarantining, number of employees from quarantine to isolation who tested positive. So we've used a positive test as a definition of who should be home, and I assume, using the percentage of total quarantines, we're using the other to say these are the kids who should be at school. So if we say in our letter that 93.5% of these students should be in school, we're saying that the kids who are not testing positive for COVID should be in school. So I think it would either be correct to call them COVID negative or to call them asymptomatic, but I don't think it would be correct to call them well.
Okay, let's
A
let
point of
Ms. Mosley
clarification.
go ahead.
Can I ask Mr. Derrick just a point of
You
clarification?
can ask me and I'll
I can ask you,
clarify.
okay. When he's saying that the word well implies that a child is completely healthy, you're suggesting that this child could be sick, they might be COVID negative, but they might have something else going on that would be smart to stay home. Is that,
Mr.
I mean, are
Lewis?
you just,
Mr.
are
Lewis,
you
is
referring
that
to just
correct?
being well?
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested to hear, I mean, I know you're hearing this discussion. I think the word well means healthy, and I don't think we really are intending to make that leap when we start making the case for these students who can return. So I'd be happy to hear any recommendations from staff of what would be a more appropriate word to define someone who is not COVID positive, which I think is ultimately the phrase.
Okay, y'all hold just a second. Dr. Royster wants the floor.
In the fourth paragraph, if I might offer for your consideration, to remove the language that says we find that our district is forcing well students to be absent from school. And my suggested replacement would be the data suggest we are unnecessarily excluding students from school. Without speaking to whether they're well, because your point, they might not be, you know,
Would you repeat?
what their other circumstances might
Would
be.
you repeat that, Dr.
The
Royster?
data suggests we are unnecessarily excluding students from school in place of begin with we and end with school, removing that section.
Is there any objection from the board to use what Dr. Royster has suggested? Hearing none, we will change that. Mr. Lewis?
So there's one more on that last. There's another reference to well in paragraph.
On the last paragraph.
Maybe Dr. Oyster can. We say here student absences were students who remained well during their quarantine period. Perhaps we could say student absences where students were unnecessarily quarantined.
That's
Oh.
fine. I'm good with that.
I'm gonna stop my thinking and working, unless you all can't agree on that. And
Well,
Then I'll
are you wanting to put the same comment on in the last paragraph? Is that what you're saying here?
Unnecessarily,
I think Mr. Lewis offered
unnecessary.
kind of a
What-
take on that
Students
same
who
thing, shortened version.
Mr. Lewis, would you repeat that?
Yes, sir. So it would say 21,207 student absences were students who were unnecessarily quarantined, period, rather than who remained
Everyone
well
on the
during-
board okay with that?
Yes.
So use that.
Okay,
and
we will
develop
change that to that. Mr. Lewis?
I have no others, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the group's flexibility in working for this revision.
Thank you very much. Let's see, Ms. Mosley, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. First, I'm not going to, out of time, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Royster, and I definitely want to say thank you to the team of, it looks like 75 people plus for their diligent data collecting, tracking, all of this. I commend them for providing the information that we see here today. And I certainly thank you for your advocacy efforts over the last few months. That is definitely something I appreciate. Real quickly, going back to a comment that you made about the only caveat about what we're asking DHEC to consider, and I want to make sure that we are real clear with our letters, not telling DHEC what to do. It's we're appealing, we're asking
Yes.
them what to consider. About the contact tracing, that you would felt like it was still necessary to let parents and be transparent about that. And I agree with you completely. My question to you is, let's say hypothetically that DHEC did agree to relax their guidelines and they said that we didn't have to contact trace anymore. We as a district could still choose to take those measures if we did. That's not something we are prevented from doing. It just means that we're no longer required by the statute to do. Is that, I just want to make sure I'm clear with what you're saying.
That is correct.
Okay.
We could do anything beyond what they require. We just cannot do less than they require, to your
Gotcha.
point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just clarification. Thank you so much.
I got Ms. Goodman Caldwell.
Okay, it's very interesting to me that there were some other people that said for revisions to this letter, but my name was the only one referenced about highlighting. But anyway, that's okay. But anyway, Dr. Royster, when you said that you hadn't spoken with them, should we wait for you to, why are we writing the letter before you speak with them, which is what we usually do, and you bring us back recommendations?
I think because of the framework you're operating in, that would probably unnecessarily push it out. It's not anything I wouldn't say to them. Just hadn't had that opportunity to say it to them. So I certainly have no problem with that. I just wanted to make clear that was one thing, make sure we're always upfront about what we have said and hadn't said. We hadn't communicated that part. It's the only part we hadn't communicated.
That's what I'm asking. When the ones that wanted to do the letter came to you, and I know that letters were written from other districts in the state, which is why we feel the need to, I guess, write a letter. But I wanted to know from you, when the people came to you about getting all of this information together, why is it that you did not go on and take the lead on that and go on and do this in order for us not to have to do this? If that's the way it usually goes, that you usually get the information and you relay it to us and make recommendations to us.
I felt that based on the information that was communicated to me, that what a number of members of this board were trying to do was simply reinforcing what I'd already said to DHEC repeatedly, that did not seem to be gaining much ground with them.
But you had said something.
The only part I hadn't said is, this
You
last
said
part
a
about
couple of things.
You just changed the employee. That's the only thing that's different.
That you said a couple of things that you would put in this. If it was coming from, if it was coming,
you all got kind of hung up on wording.
Okay, if it would have went through the advocacy committee, that would have been something that could have been done before it brought us to making a decision on sending a letter, correct?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, you could have,
I mean, because we're sitting up in here, you making changes and this, that, and the other, and that could have been done before it came to us for us to make a decision.
Yes, it could have been done that way.
Okay, that's all I have right now. That's all I have right now, Chair.
Dr. Stiles.
I
just had a couple of comments. And just one that you reviewed at our board meeting earlier this week, Dr. Royster, we're all called to advocate for our students and for our families. And I know we all feel very strongly about that, and I know we all represent different communities. But, you know, none of us could advocate strongly without a strong group at the district level, including our superintendent and his employees, who gather this data. We're not in the schools. We don't see the data. We can't keep up with what's happening daily. And I just want to commend the district, Dr. Royster, and your staff for taking the extra steps and the extra strides to provide us with current and regular information that allows us to advocate. I think that Greenville County continues to set the pace for the state. And I think we go way beyond the call of duty. And as a result, I think we have a really good product here. A really good letter that represents all of us, that we can advocate at the highest levels. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Royster, to you and your staff, because without you and without this provision, we would not be here today to advocate for this purpose. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stiles.
Thank you, Dr. Stiles. Next speaker, Linda LaVentus-Wells.
Thank you, Chairman. There's one area I think we need to delete because it's not covered. Paragraph 5, where it says, of those students ultimately testing positive for COVID-19. I think that ends the sentence, period. And delete and or developing symptoms. If we can delete that, I think it's cleaner. It discusses everything that Dr. Royster has presented and everything that the district is doing. I'm going to piggyback on what Dr. Stiles stated. We could not have done this without the assistance and listening to Dr. Royster over the last several weeks. And it's just, you know, it was time to do something. And I thank Mr. Webb and Dr. Royster and Nancy and all of those, Julie and everybody that stepped up to the plate to help us make this what it is. And the input from all of the trustees that said, you know, I'd like to see something a little stronger. I'd like to see this. That's all we were doing. We're trying to get everybody on board because this is about all of us doing what's best for our students in our schools, as well as our teachers, administrators, and so forth. We need to keep our children in school so they can be with their friends and their teachers and everyone and have lunch and so forth. So that's what this is all about. Making the environment conducive to learning and educating and parents having a voice. So I thank you, Dr. Royster, for your leadership, and I thank you for your guidance and your input on everything that you've given us throughout this process. Thank you.
Ms. LaVentus-Wells, go back to paragraph 5.
Yes, sir.
Tell everyone again what the change you would like to make.
Okay, I just want to delete and or developing symptoms. Just delete that.
On the second
Yes, sir.
line,
The second
and or develop.
sentence, and end it with COVID-19. And I also want to make sure, I know we said we'd CC.
Wait a minute, let me get that one.
Okay.
Anybody got an objection to what Ms. LaVentus-Wells has asked? Hearing none, Ms. LaVentus-Wells, go ahead. Wait, go ahead.
Yeah. Does that change the, Dr. Royster, or?
It doesn't change any meaning. Staff's advised me that's not entirely accurate to refer to it that way. And by ending it just right after COVID-19, it will carry the meaning you intend for it to have without muddying the waters with a little bit of inaccuracy.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, Ms. LaVentus-Wells, go ahead.
I also wanted to make sure that this letter, I know we kept saying, and you correct me, Mr. Chair, if I'm incorrect. We said this letter would go to Governor McMaster, the chairman of the board at DHEC.
It will go to the address of the chairman of the board with a carbon copy to the governor and to the DHEC and to the legislative delegation.
Okay.
Our legislative
Didn't
delegation.
know if it was stronger sending it to both, but you feel like that's the proper
I think that's probably the most appropriate way, isn't it?
protocol?
seems to me, if you all are agreeable with that, that seems to align with your past practice of how do you communicate
Okay.
with outside entities and informs everyone that should be informed.
Good. Then if that's the proper protocol, thank you so much.
Okay, are we all in one accord? Mr. Suddeth?
Just a simple clarification for me.
Yes, sir.
We got a quarantine update from Dr. Royster on January the 21st. We got a letter here that we've been discussing. And I've also got an email from Mr. Lewis, which also is discussing this matter. In looking at the letter, are we talking about students or teachers or both? I'm talking about the audience that we're looking at here. We're talking about the students, or are we talking about both students and teachers?
I think we're ultimately talking about students.
What question about the students?
What is the question?
It says here that we have the quarantine guidelines for close contacts is outlined in the DHEC exclusion list for COVID-19. So we've got all kinds of caveats to COVID-19. I'm trying to understand the letter as to what we're saying. It's the letter that involves the students. Is it something that DHEC has done that we're opposed to?
I don't think that the letter is opposed to it. I think they're asking that they broaden it a little bit and to allow students also be included in their guidelines. Is that correct for y'all?
Yeah.
Okay,
The guidelines,
go ahead.
the guidelines that DHEC provided for teachers to follow, we're asking that students be able to follow those same guidelines so that there's not a barrier between the two. If teachers are allowed to do this, this, and this, then we're asking that the students too be allowed to do it. Okay, so it's just to be consistent to what DHEC has asked. We want the students to be in school as long as they can be, instead of making them quarantine for 5 or 10 days without any symptoms, okay?
Then I would have to know explicitly what teachers are allowed to do that students are not allowed to do.
Just so
And
there's
then if they've got
consistency.
things that teachers need to do, that teachers are doing, that we want students to do, then I need to know what those things are. I'm trying to understand,
Hold on.
understand the letter that we're sending
I'll
out.
ask Dr. Royster
You
to
want to try and
address it.
clarify? Dr. Royster has it.
Would you repeat that, Mr. Sutton, if you don't mind?
We have got, it was been explained or discussed here that there are certain things that teachers are allowed to do. I would assume certain guidelines that we have for teachers. And so we're wanting the same guidelines for the students that we have for the teachers. Well, I need to know what guidelines the teachers have that the students don't have, and what guidelines that we would like to give to the students that we have given to the teachers, and how would that benefit the students?
Quite simply, this is kind of the short version, because I know you always like me not to use a lot of extra
Absolutely.
words. I knew you would appreciate that. Right now, if you're a teacher and you were exposed to someone with COVID, you didn't mean you have it, you were exposed to someone. You could come to work, and as long as you wore a mask, you could be at work every day. And on the 5th day, you have to take a test. And as long as the test is negative, you can still keep coming to work. Right now, if you're a student and you're exposed to COVID, you got to sit at home until the 5th day, take a test, then you could come to school. So it treats the student that's quarantined the same way we're now treating the adults, both of which are being done at the direction of DHEC. So it would keep a student from missing 5 days of school by treating them the same way as an adult. When we've looked back at our employees, of those that have to quarantine because they were exposed to somebody, ultimately about 35% of them move to isolate. They become positive or they get sick. Students is less than 7%. So what we have said to DHEC is to look at what you're doing there, how much time students are missing from school, supported by the statistics we have. And what you all are considering is simply a letter saying, kind of the bottom line to it is just treat the students the same way as the adults. And based on all our numbers and the numbers from other school districts, there's a very low rate of students moving from quarantine to isolation. Does that answer your question, Mr. Sutton?
Order. When we're looking at quarantine, and if I've been exposed, I don't know when I've been exposed. I don't know where I was exposed at. And so you say, well, hey, you've been exposed, so you need to take a test. The last test I took, it took me 4 days to get the results back. So you're saying if we take the test on the 5th day, I'll get the results on the 5th day for the student, and that way that student can go back to school. They don't have to sit out the other 5 days.
Yes, sort of. We do know where you were exposed because that's the only way we would know that you need to be quarantined. So you let somebody know at your school that your brother was sick with COVID, so you've been exposed. Or you went to some event and you stayed around somebody for more than 15 minutes and they were COVID positive, so you were exposed. Or we know you were sitting in a class within 2 feet of somebody that tested positive for COVID, and you sat there for a whole class period with them, so we know you were exposed. The count begins from the time you said you were exposed to that person. So if you told us on Sunday that you were exposed to them on Friday, the count starts with Friday's day 0, correct, Janet? So day 1, Saturday, day 2, Sunday. Starts from your exposure, not from when you took a test, not from when you began to have symptoms when you were exposed.
Why are we writing a letter that has to be done expediency speed to the governor?
I could only offer an opinion because I'm sure each board member would have a different reason that they would believe in the expediency. But my take on the expediency is at the rate of absence, when we've got 35,000 absences related to quarantine, the more days you take to voice an opinion, the more absences that accumulate. That would be my take on it. But I'm sure every board member has an individual opinion as to what they believe the urgency might be.
Well, we've changed the letter 3 or 4, 5, 6 times already. So are we going to make a decision today? Well, then I need to see what changes we made to the letter, and then I need to try to understand exactly what we have the letter being sent to the governor for. I know what you told me. And I don't really agree with when I feel like I've been exposed. If we got a problem with someone that is being quarantined and someone being isolated, quarantine says there's a possibility of being exposed or close to another person. If it comes out to be that I'm isolated, that means that I have tested positive for the virus. So if I'm a student that's tested positive for the virus, do the symptoms that the students have are the same symptoms that the teachers have? Or like we have with our other component viruses, is that the grade or the age make the difference. Teachers to me, are different than students because teachers have the possibility or probability of being sicker than the students are. The problem that I see is not with the students getting sicker. The teacher's the one who gets sicker. But the students, what I agree with, they need to be in school. And whatever we can do to get our students back in school, then I would certainly be in favor of that. What we do with the teachers, do we do something different with the teachers than we do with the students? Apparently so, because it's saying that we want to make it equal. What you do for the teachers, you do for the students.
Yes, sir. Right now, to your point, Mr. Sudduth, you're saying that the teacher could become sicker or whatever. They're being quarantined to a lesser standard than students are. So this puts the student quarantine again, you're asking DHEC to look at it. It could put it on equal footing with the adult. And now, if you look at it from the other standpoint, if people choose to be vaccinated, there is now a vaccine for basically all of our students except our very youngest pre-K students.
I would like to see a letter.
We're going to have it for you in about 5 minutes.
So I'd like to see a letter that states what Dr. Royster has said, not what this is saying.
We're going to have to talk to him to get one, I guess. I don't know.
Okay,
That's not what this is. So we're going to have the other letter in just a few minutes. Ms. Goodwin-Caldwell.
Okay. First of all, when I spoke with a couple of board members the other day about, being specific, I want all our kids back in school also because they're missing instructional time that's very valuable for their future. I wanted to ask, okay, in your presentation, you have, Dr. Royster, you have considerations for reducing student quarantines, but I don't see that language in the letter. This down here, what you're asking to relax the DHEC quarantine guidance for students to align it with the current guidance for staff. Yeah, that's fine, but is that the language that you used in your presentation is adopt same standard for students as employees? Should we use that language or should we use this language? I mean, it's basically the same thing.
Yes,
but
ma'am. I think your language conveys the same thing. Yes, ma'am. I agree with you.
What about those other? You said one of the three, right? So it would be the last one. I don't know what it's on page 9.
I believe you're right.
It's on page 9. Yes.
When you're everything, what you ask them in this letter, I believe would cover any of those points. They might look at it and say, well, we want to do this or we want to do that. I think the way your letter is written, it would cover any of those options. And I think to the point that was made earlier, if they were to decide we did not even need to contact Trace anymore, we could still make a local decision to do so, because I believe a significant number of parents would want that information, though it's obviously a great deal of work to obtain it.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lundy.
She's working.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. We'll come back, and I think Ms. Fitzer is working on the revision of the letter. Take about 5 minutes. Y'all go over this letter before we put it up for a vote. Okay? Give y'all 5 minutes to read this. Do some speed reading. Thank you. Have the revised letter. Any comments on the letter? Are we ready to vote?
I need additional time to read it.
Go ahead.
Mr. Meek, I will be adding in the name of the DHEC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Suthers, let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, you're right.
Dr. Royster, does the
Yeah. We have one that says Board of Trustees.
With his signature, his John Hancock.
It's my idea, so. I said it's my idea, so.
Yep.
So this continues. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Miss Doolin?
I'd just like to thank everybody for getting together today. I know a lot of you had to take off from work to be here. I really appreciate everyone's input and support for this. And also, just for the record, I think we should have a roll call vote on this one. Thank you.
We expect payback also. Mr. Suthers, do you have any questions? No one?
I do.
Go ahead, let's hear. Pull your mic up so everybody can hear you. Please.
I'm thinking here. My question on the handout that Dr. Royster gave out, the current quarantine options for close contact exposures for employees, and then the current quarantine options for close contact exposures, the students. I see the options for the teachers. I see the options for the students. And then I also see a consideration for reducing student quarantines. So a question I'm trying to find an answer to, I see the options for the employees, I see the options for the students. Is the same thing that the teachers have the options for doing, the students have the same options. We said we're trying to make this the same for teachers as for students.
Yes, sir. Currently, they do not. You would be asking that they be the same.
So, repeat that for me once more, Doctor.
Currently, they are not the same. You are asking that they be the same by virtue of the letter.
What about the considerations for reducing student quarantines?
That would be what you would be addressing in your letter, and you would be asking them to consider making them the same as the employees.
Why can we not put in the letter exactly what we want the governor to do? If
in my reading of the letter, Mr. Sutter, that is what you're doing.
Well, show me in the letter where it says questions that talks about close contact to 3 feet.
While it is
Contact trace, do not require quarantine if no symptoms are present. And I understand adopt the same standard for students as for employees.
yes, sir.
I see that in our letter.
The first two things represent things that we have talked with DHEC about. The last one, which is reflected in your letter, that's new. They just changed the guidance for employees on January the 16th. So we've not had any conversation with them about that specific guidance. But I believe that what your letter does is it clearly reflects the things that we've talked with them about before, which would include these things. While it may not say them specifically, it reflects the same spirit in which those were requested when you're asking them to look at their quarantine protocols.
I would just hope that what we send to the governor would be something that the governor would know exactly what we're talking about.
I believe if someone were to read,
Letters that are legalese, I don't like letters that are politicalizations. And this seems to me to be more of a politicalization and a legalese than it is our explanation as to why we think our students should be equal with our teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Suddeth. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, we've going to have a vote. Roll call, Ms. Stokes.
Mrs. Bush?
Yeah.
Ms. Doolin?
Yes.
Ms. Goodwin Cowwild?
You come back to me.
Okay. Ms. Leventis Wells?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mrs. Mosley?
Yes.
Mr. Sailors?
yes,
Dr. Stiles?
Yes.
Mr. Suddeth?
No.
Ms. Goodwin Cowwild?
Yes.
Mr. Meek?
Yes.
Nine yes, one no.
Motion carries. Mr. Sailors.
Second.
We have a motion and a second for Ms. Leventis Wells. All in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The motion carries. We are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.